It's an anti the God of the Old Testament, who is a monster.
But also the God of the Quran, the New Testament, the Hindu scripture?
Well, the God of the Quran, I don't know so much about. The God of the New Testament is widely advertised as being a bit more gentle. And certainly, on the whole, he is. There are things about the New Testament that I find, in a way, almost more objectionable than the Old Testament. But the sheer horror of the character, I said he was the most unpleasant character in all fiction, because I regard it as fiction, of course. And yes, he is. I mean, he's jealous, he's vindictive, he's callous, he's cruel.
And yet this is a God that is worshipped by, loved by, adored by, well, followed by millions, billions of people.
I hope not. I hope that the God that is adored by millions of people is a grown-up kind of God who is no longer... I hope that most people the kind of people I would like to know who worship and admire him, regard those stories as not literally true. Now, there are some who do regard them as literally true, and I suspect they either haven't read the Old Testament or they're not the kind of people I would wish to know, because you do not want to worship a character like that. By all means, worship some kind of great spirit of the universe, some kind of creative intelligence who created the universe, but don't worship this vile, vindictive monster of the Old Testament.
Why throw around these sweeping statements about religion? Not the God of the Old Testament, but religion itself being evil. I mean, do you believe religion is evil?
No.
But you say plenty of times in this book that religion is evil. You said in a speech famously that I think a case can be made that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate.
I do think that, yes. Because what I'm talking about there is faith, where faith means belief in something without evidence. Because if you believe something without evidence, then that justifies anything. You're no longer vulnerable to somebody coming back at you and saying, hang on a minute, let me argue the case. If you believe it without evidence, which is what faith is, then you don't argue the case. You say, no, I'm not arguing that case. This is my faith. It's mine. It's private. I don't dissent from it. I don't retreat from it. You're just going to have to accept it. Now, that is evil.
And yet you spend so much of your time debating.
The English cultural critic Terry Eagleton wrote a scathing review of The God Delusion by Dawkins, in which he said, at its most Philistine and provincial, it makes Dick Cheney sound like Thomas Mann, the great German novelist. There's a sense, isn't there, in which a lot of Dawkins is focused on making God into a kind of an 18th century straw man. It's a God. It's a God that really doesn't exist anymore. It maybe briefly existed with Newtonian physics, but not even Newton really believed in that God. Newton believed that some kind of interventionist miracle-working God was actually needed in order for the solar system not to collapse in on itself. So let's just talk about the idea that maybe Dawkins is, Peter, perhaps beginning with you, that Dawkins is out of date.
Well, Dawkins' whole concept of strict neo-Darwinism is out of date in view of experimental evidence, as he likes to often quote, for the existence of such disgraceful things to him as adaptive mutation, directional fine-tuning in immunity through evolutionary time, and finality and purpose in evolution, all based upon solid experimental data. Also, Dawkins is out of date in the sense that the God he's trying to commit deicide upon was, as you suggested, rendered rather superfluous by Newton, who became depressed when he realised the implications of what he had done, and then finally by Richard Dawkins. It just is that Richard Dawkins hopes that none of his audience will realise that even his Darwinism is totally out of date, and that we need something more like that of Teilhard, and to integrate Darwin and Lamarck.
Well, let's talk about a couple of points you make. You say Dawkins makes two cardinal errors. He minimises the importance of emergent evolution. What do we mean by emergent evolution? I take it we mean something that's different from a radically kind of chance-based evolution.
Absolutely, it means anything but. It's the opposite of random and chance. It's directed and purposive. By emergence we mean qualities that emerge in cosmology and evolution which could not be predicted from a knowledge of prior circumstances. Examples being, I think, critically complex life forms particularly, and reflective consciousness in Homo sapiens.
Well, we're going to deal with reflective consciousness in a minute, but you use a very, very interesting, simple example in your book from Paul Davies, who says that if evolution was purely random...
Oh, then a single protein could not have emerged by chance in 13.7 billion years.
The chance of a single protein having emerged in 13 billion years is so far beyond mathematical probability that it has to be directed.
Yes,
there has to be something else. Now, let's be purely scientific here.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that the director has to be God?
God, but not in the old anthropomorphic sense. God is somehow implicit to the evolutionary process of cosmology itself, emerging from it, not external to it.
David, there's a great definition of heresy, which says that heresy is merely the overemphasis of one particular area of truth. So you have a religion made up of a whole bunch of different truths, and a heretic will overemphasize one at the expense of the general picture. Is there a sense in which this, well, perhaps for the last century of science contemplating religion, has overemphasized the issue and perhaps let's be even-handed. Many of the people who are trying to rescue God, Peter, are overemphasising Teilhard de Chardin as an example, overemphasising the importance of evolution. It's the big discovery that erupts in the 19th century, and everyone is kind of creating evolutionary models for God ever afterwards. And Dawkins, of course, is taking the opposite view. He's using evil. He's overemphasising. Do you think that's...
Yeah, I think Dawkins is, I'd say he's half right and three-quarters wrong. Half right in the sense that he's continuing this deicide that Peter talks about, which has been happening since the time of the intellectual enlightenment, if not prior to that. The three-quarters wrong bit is that he doesn't seem to understand that, you know, as you said, Stephen, that he's knocking over a straw man. And the more straw it is, the happier he gets. So that if some theologian, for instance, like Karen Armstrong, who also lives in Britain and is also a public figure, gets up and says, hang on, the God Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in never did exist. That's what she said. What a great line. You know, the God he doesn't believe in never did exist. But the thing is that he's so wrapped up in this negative kind of hermeneutics, the hermeneutics of destruction, that he can't actually see the second part, you know, the Nietzsche's second point, which is that as we overtake and overcome one image of God, of course it's like, you know, it's like in politics, the king is dead and then they turn to the prince or the princess, long live the king. That's what God is like. And so Dawkins is getting that half right. He's a kind of like a bleak prophet of our time. A lot of people in Australia are very influenced by him. I only read him because so many of my students said, we've all read him, why don't you read him? And so I sort of was encouraged to read him. But I was appalled by, as Peter says, by how out of date it is.
But he even trots out this outrageous notion of cosmology, where he imputes to a physicist called Lee Smolin the sin of backwardly extrapolating natural selection to the multiverses to determine the fact that we would find ourselves existing in just one that can support sentient life. I mean, he engages in egregious exaggerations and extrapolations from his own science.
But if you reconfigure evolution, as Kevin has in his book, as emergence, then the whole phony war, which is what I call it, the phony war between science and religion utterly dissolves.
It's been interesting in, like Stephen McIntosh's book on, a marvellous book on evolution and Carter Piper. But the biologists wanted to keep evolution scientifically. I mean, before that, Hegel and so on were open to that. But there was a great battle of the biologists to say there. But in the latter part of the last century, there was a gradual movement back to the whole cultural evolution and the wider perspectives of it, that you really can't understand what's going on unless you marry the biology within the context, and because it changes a whole lot of things.
Peter, the second point you make, and let's get into our quantum physics discussion here, I think it's incredibly interesting. And this is the second cardinal error that you say Dawkins makes, is that skeptics like Dawkins are uncomfortable with consciousness and mentalism because such phenomena resist crude forms of materialist reductionism. So Dawkins is a hard-line materialist vision of the cosmos, and there's this problem of mind.
Can I address that? I would call Dawkins a metaphysical materialist. His materialism is a religion. That said, I would take up what you're asking there. I think, look, great biologists like Julian Huxley, who wrote the foreword to Taoist's Phenomenon of Man, refer to consciousness as reflective consciousness as introducing a new psychosocial or cultural evolution that transcends a purely biological level of evolution. And I think that's the crux of the matter, that we're looking at a totally emergent phenomenon once we get to Homo sapiens, reflective consciousness and cultural evolution, which includes science and all of these things that we're fascinated with.
Now, my dear old friend who died a couple of years ago, the great Australian zoologist Charles Birch, wonderful, wonderful man who I spent a lot of time with in his last few years, had a view that's very similar to your own. His idea was that everything in the universe is a feeling or subjective entity. The universe isn't object, it's subject. And that God is not almighty and all-powerful. He's persuasive, feeling and growing with creation. And we're all part of a single unifying consciousness. This is where this conversation ultimately leads. That we're all somehow, it's so vast that we can't see it, but we're all clinging onto the side of it somehow. And he talked about the importance of the new discoveries about, and I mean, this is the cutting edge of current science is all about trying to understand consciousness. And he talked about his friend and colleague, the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who accused him of believing that atoms had brains. And he said he didn't believe that, but there was a thinking, that there was a feeling, awareness, there was a quality. Now, a scientist that he quotes at length in his book, Peter, that I don't think you quote at all, is the American physicist Freeman Dyson, born in 1923, still alive, who argued that quantum entities at a subatomic level, such as electrons, are active choice-making agents, and that experiments force them to make particular choices from the many options open to them. And that further, the brains of animals, quote, appear to be devices for the amplification of quantum choices being made by the molecules inside our heads. And now comes the argument from design, he says. There is evidence from particular features of the laws of nature that the universe as a whole is hospitable to the growth of mind, defined as the capacity for choice.
Absolutely.
Therefore, it's reasonable to believe in the existence of a third level of mind, a mental component of the universe. Now, quantum, we're talking about the sub-atomic level.
Perfectly.
Right.
This is a field that would otherwise be known as quantum information theory, and it's been pioneered by Dyson and people like David Bohm, Basil Hiley and Pilkanen at Imperial College London, and many others. So there are two related concepts here. There's Bohm's implicate order, which is all about active information down at the quantum level, though devoid of consciousness. It's still mind in the sense of putting form into process. And then the Pauli notion of the U field, which is just another way of talking about a level of mind which is unconscious but analogous to the field theory in quantum physics.
Right. I want to give you another idea for the audience to think about, and this is Charles Birch again. And he said, first of all, you have to accept that there is something called consciousness. In other words, that it's not just a matter of chemical reactions, totally material reactions happening in your brain. There actually is a step beyond that called consciousness, and it's not material. And then it's a question of backlaying, if you like, from the higher forms to the lower. And he talked about his great friend Sewell Wright, another great biologist, who said that to believe that mind evolved from no mind is to believe in miracles. And so what Birch and others were talking about is the idea that you have to at some point backlay, rather than say God zapped down consciousness at some point in evolution, it makes more sense to say that all of matter has some primitive rudimentary quality of mind. Now, what do we think about that?
Well, I think Huxley made a comment beautifully there again, and as have many others, that there are rudimentary mind-like qualities throughout the universe. And I think the position that you're enunciating there is known as neural reductionism, or a position which would regard consciousness as a mere epiphenomenon. That is, it has no causal impact upon the universe at all, when in fact the cutting-edge work in neuroscience suggests that consciousness does have causal efficacy. Sir John Eccles, who won the Nobel Prize, along with Carl Pribram at Georgetown University, have both made the point that they are extremely hostile to an eliminative materialist approach in neuroscience, and that consciousness shapes subsequent behaviour. So it actually has causal efficacy in and of itself. It's not just some will-o'-the-wisp drifting around in the universe. It's just as causally potent as anything material.
Now let me ask you a more general question to everybody, and that is, isn't it the case, let's put Dawkins and quantum mechanics and all of that just to one side, isn't it the case that as our capacity to explain the natural world through science increases, and we explain more and more about it, and it's quite possible that we could come up in the future with a completely detailed and coherent, scientific accepted explanation of the mental running through all of matter? Mm-hmm. Isn't it the fact that as we build up a more detailed understanding of the universe, that God recedes as that knowledge extends?
I couldn't disagree more strongly. I couldn't disagree more strongly. The cutting-edge scientific work being done by the neuroscientists, like those I've mentioned, indicates that we must think about reality, the great epistemological question, not as either mind or matter or trying to reduce one to the other, but that both mind and matter exist in a relationship of complementarity, that both exist, that you can't reduce one to the other, and that we are left with some concept of the mental that cannot be reduced to brain processes or matter.
But Peter, aren't the great physicists you're talking about having mystical experiences and saying science runs out into mystery precisely because they're at the frontier, and as the frontier pulls back, the mystery will pull back? And in fact, you constantly in your book use the word numinous. Mm-hmm. Isn't the numinous something that evaporates as soon as you start to kind of scientifically explain things?
Again, I couldn't disagree more. I think the more that we understand the world scientifically, even down at the quantum level, the closer to the numinous and the mystical experiences we get, which is why it may be no coincidence that, as Paul Davies has noted, most of the great scientific minds of recent centuries have been mystics, and he mentions Einstein and Pauli and Eddington and Jans, I think the name is, and quite a number of others. So it seems to me that the further you go down the physicalist route, the more likely the scientist is to become a mystic rather than the other way around.
Let me bring Eugene in here. Have you got any views on this, Eugene? Let me put this question to you. Do you think we've been talking in our earlier conversation about an exhausted pre-scientific image of God that doesn't work anymore? Do you believe that there can be such a thing as a scientific image of God? Or does it take the numinous out of it?
Can I approach it a different way? I find, by the way, I'm an amateur in all the sciences, but as I read biology, I find the greatest effort to be reductionist and materialist. And it ends up that the biologists are very good at analysing these living beings, but they don't seem to be able to get to the holistic view, whether it's a bee or a bird or whatever. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I find curious is that whenever discussing any part of a living being, the question arises, what is it for? And every part of a bee or a bird, you can ask that question, what is it for? Now, as soon as you say, what is it for, you're asking, saying a purpose. And, how did the purpose get there? And I think that biologists tend to be retreating from the terrible question of purpose in the whole being, and so they tend to be reductionist. But life itself is the most extraordinary thing. We talk about finding signs of life in other planets and so on, and we forget that on Earth, for 3.5 billion years, we've had the favourable conditions for life in many habitats. The breakthrough to life has occurred once, as far as we know. All living beings that we study, trees, birds, and so on, they can be put into a family tree, which means that they have a common ancestor. And they do speak about the common ancestor of all life. In other words, it happened once. And of course the problem is, how did it happen? What was the trigger? I wrote on this in an article called Miracle of Life, but it seems to me that in the evolution of the universe, there have been a number of breakthroughs which scientists have not been able to explain. The first breakthrough, of course, was the Big Bang. And we can only go back to within a fraction of a second to the Big Bang. We don't know what happened at the Big Bang. We don't know what happened at the miracle of life, as I say. And then the other one is self-consciousness. These remain mysteries to us. I can come as a theologian and say, God's had a hand in this, he pulled the trigger or something. But I'm still left wondering, I can't explain those triggers, those breakthroughs.
I think one reason we can't explain these things is that, as Samuel Johnson, probably one of your favourite writers, wrote, we murder to dissect experience, whether inanimate or animate. And I think the reality, going back to Dawkins, is that science has not come up with any compelling explanation of the origins of life, let alone of complex life forms or of consciousness. And that Davies quote about, if you take the chance argument alone that not even a single protein could have emerged in 13.7 billion years, really says a very great deal. How do we explain us and what Eugene was saying, even life itself?
David, let's just assume, David, that we accept the idea that the universe is mental as well as matter. Where does that get us? Are you persuaded by the idea that opens a door onto God, or indeed, as we've touched on a few times, that it opens onto a mystical idea or potential for universal mind?
Yeah.
The idea that there is perhaps a shared...
And the East has always known this. You see, this is what's so funny about this whole conversation, is what we in the West are now discovering, inverted commas, the East has known for thousands of years, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, this is a fascinating thing again about our planetary moment of unitary consciousness, that the West is discovering its repressed Eastern aspect. You know, for us, God for so long was out there in the cosmos, that got eclipsed, and now we're experiencing a universal mind along the lines of Charles Birch, the idea that there's subjectivity in all things. And this is a very, very interesting moment. No wonder so many Christians today are abandoning Christianity and turning to the East.
To Buddhism.
You know, to Buddhism in particular, because Buddhism has been there for thousands of years before us, and they're not going through all the convolutions that we in the West, and my friends, many of my friends were brought up Catholics, they're now Buddhists because they say, oh no, we can't be bothered with Catholicism anymore. It's too difficult. I don't want to go into all that contortion. But I'm actually in it for the long haul. I personally want to see our Western religion go through this evolution. It's going to be painful and it's going to create a lot of strife. But to me, the idea of the mental, as you put it, across all things, which after all is in the West in Platonism. They called it the anima mundi, the soul of the world. So it is there, but it got sort of suppressed by this very, very external idea of God. We need to develop that, and I think that you were suggesting earlier, does this get rid of the mystery? Hopefully not. Hopefully by just talking about mystery isn't just because we talk about Uluru or Katachuta or Kakadu doesn't mean it goes away. It just means we know it better. And I think that was Peter's disagreement with you, actually, was that just because scientists are talking about the numinous doesn't mean the numinous is suddenly being sort of explained away as a merely scientific
to put
hypothesis.
my point more bluntly, doesn't science kill everything it touches? Doesn't it kill the mystery?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think good science cultivates the mystery. Good science allows mystery to become more conscious. Bad science kills off the mystery, but we have to make this differentiation between
Good science leads to
good and bad
mysticism.
science.
Good science leads to mysticism.
Good science leads to mysticism, and also I think good science leads to ecology. You see, what he was saying about objectivity and subjectivity reminded me of Thomas Berry, who's one of the grandfathers of the ecological movement. He said we won't be able to understand the ecological question until we move from understanding the world as a collection of objects to a communion of subjects.
Well, this leads to a question I was going to put to Kevin, which is that the idea that the universe is subjective, or that everything in it is subjective, opens the door onto an ethical dimension. If the universe is thinking and feeling, and all creatures are conscious to some degree, ethical issues about ecology emerge, and about things like animal rights become central issues for your theology.
Yes, when I was learning about the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, we were taught suicide, murder and so on. But today, I'd be surprised if anyone teaching the fifth commandment didn't discuss ecocide and geocide and so on. Not as a sort of new age thing, but as a profound moral issue. And it's been great to see in ethics, if you've been looking at ethics the last 10 or 20 years, it's been great to see how more and more the holistic approach to ethics rather than the humanisation question has been brought in. And no serious teacher of ethics about things like thou shalt not kill wouldn't incorporate the whole thing. And just a couple of other points connected with that. I like what in a way Dawkins and Hitchens have done insofar as if people listen to them, to really make sure we get rid of those old images that no longer have any sense. But I somehow protested against what I thought was a very superficial. I was listening to a talk by Christopher Hitchens recently, that he gave a few years ago. Got all the laughs, but I thought it was very superficial. Anyone could, I could go to a science convention and speak against the evils of nuclear energy and what science has done in the Holocaust and all that there, and prove nothing. That thing that I very much like what David was saying, that, and too with Eugene, with his work in Aboriginal people, I found it fascinating. The West went a certain way, and in a way it brought us enormous technological advances, incredible. But it lost its soul to some degree. And I see a very hopeful sign now of recovering, if we know what we're on about. That's why later I think you'll address that question. A major problem with the churches have got dogmatic handcuffs on them. There's a real problem with that one, because they'll be trapped in a world that's a religious world that's left them or is leaving them. I'm speaking a bit about more the West rather than African spirituality.
Well, I think that's a comment the great physicist Pauli made just very briefly, that for 400 years the West, with its materialistic science, has thrown out or exorcised spirit or psyche only to have it return in unwanted forms, and that it needs to be reintegrated into a more holistic view of the universe and of ourselves.
David's point about the East, and it's very, I really like that, their recovery of something, you know, the Hinduism and so on that they've known all the time, or Buddhism.
Let me briefly change the subject a bit, and that is one of the big things that Peter talks about is the end of anthropomorphism, the idea of God as a person, as a father, as who intervenes into creation. Eugene, is God a person?
I would say that I'm a person, and I think that God must be that or more. In other words, the awareness of being the origin. See, I know myself as a person because I do things and I take responsibility for things. And things I did as a child, I own responsibility. So I've somehow linked with that childhood of 5. That to me is quite a mystery, that I own these things. I think that God owns things like a person. I hear about transpersonalism, and I really wonder what people mean by transpersonalism. I wonder, for example, are they trying to get away from the fact that God is a person?
Well, I think that's part of the tendency of a lot of what we've been discussing is, to put it crudely, that where it entered popular culture in a very brilliant way was in Star Wars, with the idea of, may the Force be with you. Do we worship? Is it possible to conceive of a religion where you might think that people would be wanting to worship a force, or in fact is, we were talking earlier about being hardwired for religion. Is there not something very universal in all religions and in all times and places of turning God into a person and of needing it to be a person? And if it's not a person, what's the point?
Well, someone once said that it would be very difficult to imagine themselves praying to a mathematical equation. That's what we're reducing God to. So we have to come up with something
which
personal.
is what Stephen Hawking would have us.
And I think that's what Taz, with all due respect, is doing. He's trying to talk about something that is personal but transcends out of the finiteness of our human egos.
Stephen, when I went through my atheist period, which was a stage of my faith,
Me too.
yeah, and I think Peter did too, probably at the same time, during our university degrees. You can't believe in God and get a university degree. They'll just they won't give you good marks. You have to say that God is dead, otherwise you won't get A's and get a scholarship. But what saved me was reading Paul Tillich, because in his book, The Shaking of the Foundations, 1948, he said, what foundations have been shaken? And he said, the idea of God as a person has been shaken. And he said, and using the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, he said, if we take the pronoun a out, instead of saying God is a being, instead we say God is being. And my God, just taking that a out, the whole tension went out of my body. And then I began to realise I could have a completely new relationship with God by just taking the pronoun a out. If God is being, then that's a completely different ballgame to God is a being. God is a being is, for me, with all due respect to what Eugene said, is mythology. God is a being is myth. But God is being is philosophy. and human experience and existentialism.
I think that's
And
what
that's
the
how-
mystics...
What's that?
When I had my near-death experience, my experience of the light and the warmth and the radiance was an infinite being and presence, not a person.
No. And that's how...
And your description, as I read it in your book, is very typical of the descriptions that people who
Yes,
have
very
near-death-
typical,
and
and
they
it's-
are disintegrating, integrating
Yes,
with
it is
some
a-
wider reality
it
kinds
is
of
a being and
experiences.
a presence and of great love.
Mm.
I'll come at this another way. We have an image of a person, and I think our image of a person gets in the way of us saying that God is person. Again, going back to Eckhart, he says something like, strip away from yourself everything you could say about yourself. My nationality, my family, my beliefs, my work, and so on. Strip all those away, layer by layer by layer, and you get back to something that is quite primordial. And you can't say anything about it. It's so primordial. And this, I think, is when the revealing of God's name to Moses. Moses said, "Who will I say sent me?" And say, "I am." And that's the root, the I, at the subject of that sentence.
But Eugene, with all due respect, you have a very profoundly mystical understanding of the personhood of God. And I think what Stephen's getting at is that this ain't what everybody else is thinking. Everybody else has still got this idea that there's some kind of man in a cloud or something looking down. That idea of personhood, which is just an absolute cliche of what you're describing.
Yes, I
You're
would reject
describing
that too.
personhood as a very deep experience.
But I'm also making another point, David, which is if it's not a person and it's just a force, how do you base a religion on that? Who wants to go to church and pray to a mathematical equation?
Well, exactly. And this is where Eugene's point is vital. That is to say, my experience is that while Paul Tillich is right, God is not a person or a being, but being. But I think Eugene's point that he made earlier was that in order for us to have a relationship with God, to bring in the relational element, God needs to become a person.
That's my point.
And therefore we need to put the personhood of God in inverted commas. Because otherwise, if God isn't a person, and by the way, I'm thinking about this ecologically, if the environment isn't an animated subjective presence, we can't become feeling related to the environment. You know, if nothing is sacred, nothing matters. And so I think that the personhood of God is both for me true and untrue at the same time. And I think it's a paradox, and I wouldn't want to side with either one or the other, because I know a lot of people, a lot of devout Christians for whom the personhood of God, through the personhood of Christ, becomes absolutely vital. But for me, when I was going through my university training, I had to chuck all that out because really I couldn't relate to it.
I think that why the Trinity, and there's parallels in Hinduism there, is really an important, taking away the problem, major problem of language and the male thing and all that there. It's trying to express a metaphor of communion.
Yeah.
Communion with the interdependence of all things, of the energy of the universe, that flows through. And therefore, I think it's fundamental, this, and I'd go further, I believe it's an energy of love. It's an energy of love. Now, I don't think, for myself, I could say anything more much about Trinity, because it's trying to express something about the innate relationship that's in everything really, as an ideal, that we strive for.
Right.
And,
Well, the way I recovered from my atheism finally was to discover that God is both infinite being and presence and love, and therefore something I could relate to. I couldn't relate to being in some sort of abstraction.
Yeah.
Yes.
It had to be some presence or
Yes.
loving
Right.
energy.
It sounds
there
like,
as
Peter,
well.
we should set up a new society called Atheists Anonymous.
My
Would it look a bit like the
qualification-
12-step program?
My only qualification for chairing this meeting is that I'm not an atheist today.
I've got two quick, cheeky questions to ask you. One, the first is about the idea of evolving consciousness, a theology of evolving mind and consciousness. Don't we already have a religion based on that idea? Scientology? But I mean, that's a cheeky question in a way, but there's a serious dimension to it, which is, isn't there a tendency there in Scientology that you can imagine all of this conversation about this evolving universe and evolution of mind and so on, still somehow being directed into that kind of perverse way?
Perverse
Absolutely.
it would be, because
Perverse is the
they're
key
neither
word.
scientific nor concerned with understanding, with logos.
Yeah.
Right.
And they manipulate
And
people.
Scientology, of course, isn't informed by all the discourses we've been
No.
talking
Absolutely,
about.
that's the
You know,
difference.
it's not informed by philosophy, it's not informed by physics, it's not informed by depth psychology, it's not informed by ecological sciences, and it's not informed by Eugene's cosmology either. And therefore, it's, in a sense, like Dawkins, a very outdated discourse. Although you might say it got hold of this, Stephen, early, and ran with it, but in a kind of a perverse kind of way, and not a way that I would wish to be identified with.
Yes, I wouldn't want to be identified with religious perversions either.
No.
In a way, they hijack both religion and science
Yes.
and call it Scientology.
Yes, and they're not doing religion or science. They're doing ideology,
Right.
which is something else altogether.
And my last question is taking it into a completely other direction, and that is, all matter contains mind, all mind fills the universe, God is mind, so all is God and God is all. Isn't the direction of that kind of thinking, doesn't it ultimately lead you to pantheism?
Well, it could, but I suppose a religious point of view, as I understand it, is panentheism, and that is God is within and beyond.
Within and beyond at the same time.
Within and beyond.
Yeah.
And so I really have this sense of reverence for the interdependence of all things as an expression of a divine energy. But also there's a beyond that's a mystery for me, and that's why I'm uncomfortable that I have to use them of words about it. You know, as St. Francis went through the world singing out, "Who are you, God, and who am I?" Two of the Francis of Assisi, basic questions. How do I get a language? And I paused before that mystery and struggled with it, actually.
Unless we differentiate between pantheism and panentheism, there's no future for Christianity at all. Because Paul, in his letters to the Corinthians, said, all things are in God. And of course, the word used, it's an untranslatable word, panentheism, all in God. And that gets translated into a string of English words. But a lot of people, you know, in this country and other countries, hearing all these discourses do end up with pantheism. But that's the death knell of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We must have the transcendental dimension. And as Kevin said, if all things are in God, then God is bigger than all things.
That was Todd's last statement in his book, shortly before he died too, Erit in omnibus omnia deus, that God may be all in all.
So there are a lot of dangers at the moment. There's an enormous number. The big danger of atheism, the big danger of pantheism, the big danger of relativism, and all the bishops and archbishops who are stopping us from having some of these conversations are terrified that the knowledge that we're talking about today are going to lead into these nihilistic, where people aren't going to believe anything.
Let me ask you one more question, just picking up on the big dangers. Is there one other big danger? Is this talk, the kind of Peter talk of quantum physics and the universe as mind and all of that, is it just a kind of a new form of Gnosticism? You know, a new form of highly intellectualized religion thinking that's only for a very, very tiny elite, and that absolutely does not, in a sense, kind of intersect with what most people are thinking.
No.
I couldn't agree less. I think it's very much, as dare I mention him again, Jung, a matter of heart, of feeling and emotion. It engages us in our whole being, in feeling and emotion as well as intellect, or not at all.
And
Otherwise, we
that's
just fragment ourselves.
I'm just throwing it out there.
Stephen,
I feel passionate.
yeah.
I
The
feel passionate.
experience is critical today. That people
Experience,
must experience. For example,
yes.
If I'm taking Christianity for a moment, an experience of the living Christ that touches our being, that moves us and shakes us, you know, in a good sense, I mean. Otherwise, it's just, as you said rightly, so Stephen, it's a kind of neo-Gnosticism that a few people have this inner knowledge and everyone's left, whereas they're paying mortgages and they're trying to live and to work each day and make sense of family. And unless it touches into that, we've got a problem.
I think that's why Milton left me cold with Paradise Lost. It was so cerebral and intellectual and beyond.
Yes. But Stephen, the Gnostics didn't believe in the incarnation.
No.
Now all of us here do.
Mm.
And in fact, Peter's work, which takes us into the direction of the cutting edge of science, actually engages us in a further step, which I'd call continuing incarnation.
It's incarnational
Yeah.
science.
Yeah, it's incarnation.
Yeah.
That's why your book is called The Individuation of God.
And I've been accused of heresy. For
Well,
that.
indeed, but that's nonsense. Because what you're doing is showing that incarnation is an ongoing process.
Mm.
And coming back to Eugene, with Meister Eckhart, that's what Meister Eckhart believed.
Mm.
He said that the key to the understanding of the universe is the ongoing incarnation of the Godhead in all life forms. That's Eckhart, straight Eckhart. So what you're doing is not heresy, and nor is it New Age Gnosticism. But I do know that a lot of conservatives in the churches like to represent these discourses, misrepresent them actually, in a negative way so that they don't happen. But we're not going to end up in Gnosticism, and we're not going to end up in any of the other isms, which to my mind are all dead ends. Yeah. Thank you.
Breath of Creator, essence of star.